Now I invite Dr. Keller to share some information about policy development surrounding community college funding in Texas.
Great. Thanks, Jesse. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the broader context for what's been happening in Texas community colleges, also build on some of the points that Rick made about the public's views about community colleges that we've dug into, tell you a little bit about the Texas Commission on Community College Finance. That's the commission for which this work has been conducted. And then also give you a quick overview of the recommendations that have been released. So now let's move ahead to talk about the community college context in Texas. The big context is just that our economy is changing faster than anyone anticipated. And so for all the challenges that we have in terms of our educational attainment, our economy is accelerating in the direction of needing additional skills, additional credentials. So our best, most recent estimates from the Georgetown Center for Education and Workforce is that by 2030, about 62% of all jobs in Texas would require some kind of post-secondary education. So next slide. Now, our enrollments in Texas have been a little more stable than in a lot of other states over the last couple of years, but we do see that our two-year institutions are still down from their pre-pandemic levels. So overall, our public institutions are down by nearly 11%. Our public universities, our independent institutions, and health-related institutions have recovered in their overall enrollments from where they were pre-pandemic. Next slide. Now, let's drill in a little more on community colleges, because our Texas community college enrollments, when you look at what's been happening, I think it tells an interesting story about policy and about, I would argue, the potential of policy to drive changes in enrollments and changes in outcomes for community colleges. So if you look back over the last decade, so pre-pandemic, our community college enrollments, if you pull out the dual credit enrollments, had actually been declining. This is particularly striking because over the last decade, Texas added more new residents than any other state. We added nearly 4 million new residents, but you can see that that the growth in enrollments at community colleges was really only in dual credit, where we were losing ground in our workforce enrollments, and we were losing ground in our transfer enrollments of students who weren't in high school. Part of this is driven by policy changes. So Texas was one of the states that a couple of decades ago aligned incentives to encourage colleges to partner with school districts and provide additional opportunities for students to be able to earn college credit, whether in high school. So if you go back to, say, 1999, we had about 10,000 students in Texas who were enrolled in high school while they were also enrolled in college, versus just before the pandemic, we had about 190,000 students who were high school students who were also enrolled in community colleges. So that illustrates the importance and the power of getting those incentives right and aligning those incentives with state policy goals. Next slide. Now, the issues are really concentrated with our community colleges. So in our Texas state technical colleges over the last couple of years, we've actually seen enrollments up considerably. Now that's a much smaller system than our community colleges. They're up by about 44%. They have more niche offerings, tend to focus on the highest demand workforce credentials, short-term workforce credentials. One of the things that's notable is that Texas has a different funding system for our Texas state technical colleges. That's an outcomes-based system that's focused on, it's a return value model. So it's really focused on returning a portion of the wage premium for the graduates from the Texas State Technical College system back to the college. And so as a result of putting that new system in place, which also helped them gain additional political support in Texas, that helped fuel rapid increases in the workforce education enrollments at the Texas State Technical Colleges. we didn't make that alignment for our community colleges, and we can see that the enrollments have lagged, particularly in workforce programs. Next slide. For just a little bit of context on our current Texas community college funding formula, it's primarily contact hours, so nearly 80% of the funding is contact hours based on the type of credits that are taught. There's some core operations funding. There is a portion of the community college funding formula that uses a version of momentum points, which we call success points in Texas. But those are based on 3-year rolling averages, and there's 11 different potential success points that are a mix of inputs and outputs. So any given individual success point doesn't actually drive much additional money year to year to colleges. The other important thing to know about Texas community college finance today is it's not a dynamic funding formula. It's just an allocation model. So the legislature makes some certain appropriation in the biennial legislative session, and then that's used, and then the formulas are used to determine the allocation of funding to the colleges. So that means that individual colleges might actually increase enrollment but lose funding if they're not increasing enrollment at the rate of the rest of the state. Also notable is that our community college funding formulas don't include adjustments for student need and don't really include many adjustments for scale. Despite the fact that on the K-12 side, Texas has one of the more equitable public school finance formulas that has fairly robust, detailed, and sophisticated adjustments for student need and for scale. Next slide. Now, I did think it would be helpful to insert a couple of slides this is from some of the research that we commissioned. We can go through these very quickly because some folks in Texas and policymakers will say, well, it looks like students are voting with their feet. Maybe they just don't believe the value is there from the community colleges. So we commissioned a statewide poll to dig deeper into what Texans think about their community colleges. We had a good sample of about 5,000 Texans. Next slide. And what we found is almost everyone has a positive impression of Texas community colleges. So 40% of the folks who were polled have very positive views of community colleges. Next slide. About the same as you see in some of the national data that Rick was mentioning. We had 85% of the respondents said they believe that the credentials from community colleges are valuable. And then next slide. They told us that they thought it was particularly important for community colleges to focus on aligning their offerings with workforce needs. And then finally, next slide. One of the things that was striking to us is that we saw a strong majority of Texans tell us that they supported basing community college funding more on student outcomes. They particularly talked about job placement and numbers of students completing credentials and what the income or wages were like for students who have graduated from community colleges. Okay, next slide. So that all sets the stage for the Texas Community College Finance Commission. And so the last Texas legislature established the Community College Finance Commission in SB 1230 with a broad charge to make recommendations for reforming our community college system, especially so that we could be sufficient for sustaining viable education and training offerings across the state. So the commission included, next slide. So we have a mix of public members. The chairman of the commission, Woody Hunt from El Paso, was really the ideal person to chair the commission. He's a former member of the coordinating board, the UT Board of Regents. He's led multiple commissions and recognized and well-respected business leader in Texas. Also key members of the legislature, including Senator Creighton, who chaired the Senate Higher Education Committee last session, now chairs the Senate Education Committee as well as the Higher Education Committee. also Representative Oscar Longoria, and Representative Gary Van Dever. And then we had 4 community college presidents and chancellors from a mix of large and small colleges. So the coordinating board, the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, was charged to support the commission in its deliberations, we, through a mix of public funds and also help from philanthropy, also were able to engage leading state and national experts. You're going to hear from one of those later, Martha Snyder from HCM Strategist. HCM was one of our partners in this work. Dennis Jones from the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems has worked closely with us with the commission to support its deliberations. And then we engaged a broad array of researchers to help us understand what the cost environment is like for our community colleges, who's attending, what's happening to students while they're in the pipeline, and what kind of outcomes the colleges are getting. Dr. Lori Taylor from Texas A&M was our principal researcher for the project, and also was delighted that we were able to engage Bruce Baker and Jesse Levin to help support our work, to help us understand better those uncontrollable cost drivers, especially associated with student need and scale, so that we could have a much more equitable community college finance system than we do today. Next slide. The commission it conducted its work primarily through 3 different working groups. One of those working groups focused on college operations, one focused on student support structures, and the other one focused on workforce education. Now, as we dug into these issues, the unique cost pressures of small colleges kept coming up as a recurring theme. I mentioned earlier, Texas added more residents than any other state over the last decade, but that growth was really concentrated in about 10 Texas counties. So out of 254 counties, we saw the rapid growth in about 10 counties. More than half our Texas counties actually lost population. So we had a number of those colleges, those smaller and rural serving colleges, that it wasn't just that their enrollments were down, they're in counties that are losing population. A pretty dramatic mix of different cost environments that those colleges have to operate in, and different kind of economic environments the colleges have to operate in. So with help from philanthropy, we were able to partner with Jobs for the Future, do a statewide listening tour, dig deeper into these issues, and also identify with the colleges where there might be opportunities to reduce costs for the operation of the smaller colleges. Okay, so next slide. So I'm very excited to share with you all. Here's our consensus recommendations that are about to be formally published in the report this next week. So the community college finance recommendations fall into 3 major categories. I'll go through each of these very quickly, but around state funding for outcomes, affordability for students, and targeted investments in college capacity. So next slide. Okay, first, around state funding for outcomes. So what the commission recommended was a robust outcomes-based formula. So that right now, the state share of community college funding is about 25%. The majority of funding for our community colleges comes from a mix of local property taxes and tuition revenue. But as I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of the funding today is allocated based on inputs, based on contact hours, without any kind of adjustments for scale or for student need. So what the commission recommended is a robust, modern, outcomes-based formula that would be focused on production of what we in Texas call credentials of value, credentials that translate into wage premiums for individuals, with bonuses for the production of credentials in targeted fields, and also for students who are low income, students who are not college ready, and also adult students. In particular, the recommendations about adjustments for adult students were directly informed by what we were hearing from the researchers who were working on the cost function and that certainly resonated with the colleges and the commission. Also, there would be incentives for students who transfer and students completing sequences of dual credit courses that apply to academic and workforce programs, and also adjustments for student needs across those outcomes for the low-income students and the students who are academically disadvantaged, and for the transfer students who are adults. Now, how do you make sure, though, that overall the system is going to be equitable when you have more of an outcomes-based system? So to tackle that challenge, what the commission's recommendation is in 1.2 here, that we stipulate that the operation and instruction at community colleges is primarily going to be a local function, but where you don't have access in your local property tax base to the resources from local tax effort, there needs to be a guaranteed yield. In the calculation of that guaranteed yield, there also needs to be consideration of student need, because students are academically disadvantaged, economically disadvantaged adult students, and also a scale adjustment. And then finally, we're talking about a radical reform of our Texas community college system. So the commission recommends that the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board and the commissioner would have flexibility to make sure that we can make adjustments for unintended consequences. Next slide. I'll go through these last two very, very quickly, but I did want to emphasize that also the commission recommended major investments in student financial aid and need-based aid for students that could be used for short-term workforce programs, as well as our academic degree and certificate programs through what we call our Texas Educational Opportunity Grants, that would be on par with the kind of financial aid provided to students at our four-year institutions, or at least the access would be on par. Second, that there would be new targeted financial aid for dual credit, so that students across Texas who are eligible for free or reduced lunch programs would not have to pay tuition fees for dual credit. That's also informed directly by another component of the research that Dr. Taylor led, where we did see that increase in dual credit enrollments. We didn't see low-income students increasing at the same rate as students who were not economically disadvantaged, and primarily because of financial barriers. So a number of colleges will waive or discount tuition for dual credit courses for students who are eligible for free or reduced lunch. A number of school districts will pay for those students, but there are many places in Texas where neither of those things happen. And so low-income students would have to pay out of pocket either for tuition and fees, or at least for cost of instructional materials for books. And so there are significant financial barriers. So this would be a major leap forward for access to have targeted financial aid for dual credit. And then also recommendation on the expansion of paid work-based learning experiences, paid internships, apprenticeships, and also work study. And then next slide. And then finally, the commission recommends that we make additional targeted investments to bolster the capacity of our colleges, especially seed grants for high demand workforce programs. The colleges also advocated for the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board to establish a center focused on interinstitutional cooperation and shared services to help reduce cost to some of those smaller colleges. And there were a number of different areas that colleges helped identify that we might be able to accelerate that work over these next several months. And then finally, we have a couple of colleges, handful of colleges that are real leaders in crosswalking non-credit programs to credit programs, so that we can make sure that the non-credit workforce programs are convertible and stackable towards other kinds of credentials. And so we're working with the colleges to see how we might leverage that work to develop more of a state crosswalk, so we can make more of those short-term workforce programs convertible and stackable in Texas. Okay, next slide. And then one more, just to give folks a sense of where we are. The next step. So next week, the recommendations that I just outlined will be published. We're looking forward to working with the legislature through the rest of the fall and into the spring, and as they develop the legislation and the writers, the budget writers that are associated with the work, and then we'd be going into implementation. Now, the research didn't just end. It's not one and done for any of these research projects. They'll be continuing over the next several months. And in particular, I'm excited about the work that we're going to be discussing today around costing out the cost of providing education at community colleges, because I think that over time, this will help us both dial in the initial recommendation so we can have a more robust evidence-based system, and then we make sure we're not inadvertently disadvantaging any districts, for example, like districts that serve concentrations of first-generation students or adult learners. But over time, our hope in Texas is that we could develop this work that Jesse and Bruce and their teams have pioneered into a simulation that we can use as a validation structure as we continue to refine and implement our new Texas Community College finance system. So we're excited about this work and look forward to the conversation. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much. Really, really exciting to hear about the commission's work and how it's all progressing in Texas.